What happens when the leader of the world's largest nuclear arsenal abandons conditional warnings and issues direct ultimatums to the most powerful military alliance in history? This morning, Vladimir Putin crossed a rhetorical threshold that intelligence analysts describe as fundamentally different from his previous threats. This wasn't the usual ambiguous saber rattling we've grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. This was a shift from conditional language to definitive declaration. Not NATO should not do this, but NATO has already done this. For the Kremlin, red lines haven't merely been approached, they have been erased. The language of warning has transformed into the language of action, and that transformation has triggered what may be the most dangerous moment in modern great power relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've spent my career studying how conflicts escalate between nuclear powers, and what we're witnessing represents exactly the kind of strategic miscalculation that transforms manageable tensions into existential confrontations. Putin's ultimatum isn't diplomatic posturing designed to extract concessions. It's a fundamental challenge to the post-Cold War security architecture that has prevented direct superpower conflict for 3 decades. Point. The immediate NATO response confirms that alliance leadership understands the gravity of this moment. Within seconds of Putin's address, NATO's integrated command network activated emergency protocols. Reconnaissance assets moved immediately to enhance surveillance positions. Nuclear-capable strategic airfields across the alliance elevated to high alert status. Warsaw tightened security along the eastern flank, while Oslo increased sensor sweeps across Arctic approaches. Most significantly, the Pentagon issued special coordination orders to American forces throughout Europe, suggesting that contingency planning has moved from theoretical exercise to operational preparation. This isn't routine crisis management. This is preparation for scenarios that alliance planners hoped would remain forever hypothetical. Putin's specific grievances reveal why this ultimatum represents something qualitatively different from previous Russian complaints. Moscow is no longer merely objecting to weapons deliveries or training programs. Russian leadership now characterizes Western support as direct participation in warfare against Russian forces, viewing real-time intelligence sharing, targeting coordination, and long-range strike system integration as evidence that NATO has already become a direct combatant. From the Russian perspective, every deep strike against Russian territory using Western-supplied systems represents a NATO-approved operation executed with NATO intelligence and NATO targeting assistance. American missiles have become extensions of NATO firepower, making the distinction between Ukrainian and Western operations meaningless from Moscow's strategic viewpoint. This shift in Russian perception matters enormously because it changes the fundamental logic of escalation. When Moscow views Western support as direct participation rather than proxy assistance, Russian responses will be calibrated to address what they see as direct NATO aggression rather than Ukrainian military actions. The psychology driving Russian decision-making has evolved in ways that make traditional deterrence calculations increasingly unreliable. Hardliners within the Kremlin have convinced Putin that the West isn't merely trying to encircle Russia, but to permanently neutralize it as a great power. This belief in existential threat transforms escalation from strategic choice into survival necessity. Point. Deterrence theory works when rational actors can calculate costs and benefits with reasonable accuracy. But when a great power believes its long-term survival is being systematically undermined, the mathematics of deterrence changes fundamentally. Normal cost-benefit analysis becomes irrelevant when the perceived alternative is national extinction. Current Russian military movements reflect this dangerous shift in strategic thinking. Satellite reconnaissance confirms missile brigades moving closer to Western periphery positions. Naval fleets have altered course from standard patrol vectors. Strategic bomber wings have received surprise activation orders for crew readiness drills. This isn't full-scale war mobilization, but it represents the use of uncertainty as strategic asset, keeping opponents guessing about Russian intentions while maintaining maximum operational flexibility. The objectives driving this confrontation reveal why diplomatic resolution has become so difficult. Moscow's goal is ensuring that Ukraine never becomes a Western forward operating base, capable of projecting NATO power directly against Russian territory. NATO's goal is preventing Russia from re-establishing hegemony over Eastern Europe. Washington's goal is degrading Russian power without entering direct hot war. These strategic endgames are mutually exclusive, creating what strategists call a geopolitical pressure cooker, where competing objectives generate increasing tension without obvious release mechanisms. Each side's minimum acceptable outcome contradicts the other's maximum tolerable concession. European reactions illustrate the impossible strategic positions this ultimatum has created. Eastern flank nations, including Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, view this as confirmation that hybrid warfare targeting them directly is imminent. They're preparing for scenarios that extend well beyond theoretical contingency planning. Western European nations face the nightmare of economic disruption and political fragmentation if current tensions explode into open conflict. The universal fear is drift, the process by which regional allies become drawn into superpower confrontation regardless of their strategic preferences or national interests. European leaders find themselves trapped in what analysts describe as strategic straitjackets. Retreat appears to signal weakness that invites further Russian pressure, but advance toward direct confrontation risks exactly the broader conflict that careful crisis management has prevented for decades. Point. Washington faces Putin's dual agenda, freezing Western aid to Ukraine while simultaneously testing American resolve. The deterrence paradox complicates every American decision. Demonstrating strength might provoke the war it's designed to prevent, while showing restraint could be misinterpreted as capitulation that encourages additional Russian aggression. The space between these alternatives has become razor thin. American decision-makers must calibrate responses that demonstrate resolve without appearing reckless, maintain alliance credibility without triggering escalation, and preserve strategic ambiguity without creating dangerous misunderstanding about American intentions. Intelligence signals suggest this crisis has moved beyond rhetorical threats into operational preparation. Communication traffic at Russian strategic nodes has increased dramatically, following patterns that Moscow typically employs when it wants to broadcast war readiness rather than conceal it. The intelligence community faces a critical assessment challenge, determining whether this represents psychological warfare or genuine preparation for kinetic escalation. Point. Ukrainian interpretation of Putin's threats provides another perspective on their significance. Kiev views the ultimatum not as warning, but as confirmation that deep strikes are inflicting real strategic damage on Russian capabilities. The threats validate Ukrainian arguments that Western aid is achieving genuine strategic impact, rather than merely prolonging conflict. However, Ukrainian officials also recognize that a cornered Russia represents an unpredictable variable in strategic calculations. When the Kremlin feels walls closing in, normal diplomatic playbooks become obsolete. Desperation can produce either collapse or extremely dangerous miscalculation. The classic security dilemma now operates at maximum intensity. Every player on the strategic chessboard believes their actions are purely defensive while viewing opponents' moves as inherently aggressive. Moscow sees an encirclement noose tightening. Brussels sees a revisionist power destroying European order. Washington sees itself drawing necessary lines against authoritarian aggression. Point. This symmetry of fear represents the most volatile mechanism in global politics. When each side genuinely believes it's defending legitimate interests against existential threats, the space for compromise disappears while incentives for preemptive action increase. The current moment represents what strategists call a strategic turning point, where normal crisis management mechanisms prove inadequate for managing the scope and intensity of competing pressures. Traditional diplomacy assumes that rational actors prefer negotiated solutions to military confrontation, but that assumption breaks down when core interests are perceived as non-negotiable. Putin's ultimatum signals that Russian leadership has concluded that negotiation within the existing framework will not produce acceptable outcomes. This represents a fundamental challenge to the institutional architecture that has managed great power competition since 1945. NATO's immediate activation of emergency protocols demonstrates alliance recognition that traditional escalation management may no longer be sufficient for preventing conflict between nuclear-armed powers. The speed and scope of the response suggests contingency planning for scenarios that extend well beyond anything previously considered operationally relevant. Point. Regional implications extend far beyond Europe. China's calculations regarding Taiwan will be influenced by how this crisis develops. If NATO demonstrates resolve that forces Russian retreat, Beijing may conclude that American alliance systems retain deterrent power. If NATO responses appear weak or divided, China may interpret this as evidence that American security guarantees are unreliable. Middle Eastern powers are equally attentive to these dynamics. Iran's regional strategy, Israel's security planning, and Saudi Arabia's alignment choices all depend partially on assessments of American willingness to confront challengers to the international order. The global stakes explain why this ultimatum has triggered such intense responses across multiple theaters. What appears to be a regional European crisis actually represents a test of whether existing international institutions can manage great power competition without resort to military force. Economic markets reflect the gravity of current tensions. Defense stocks are rising on expectations of increased military spending. Energy prices are climbing on concerns about supply disruption. Point. Currency markets are showing volatility patterns consistent with preparations for major international crisis. These financial indicators often provide more accurate assessments of escalation risks than official government statements. Market participants have powerful incentives for realistic risk assessment that political leaders sometimes lack. The absence of clear de-escalation mechanisms makes current tensions particularly dangerous. Cold War crisis management relied on established communication channels, mutual understanding of escalation dynamics, and shared interest in avoiding nuclear confrontation. Many of those institutional safeguards have atrophied during the post-Cold War period. Current leaders on both sides have limited experience managing direct great power confrontation. The skills required for nuclear crisis management differ substantially from those needed for regional conflict resolution or economic competition. Learning these skills during active crisis carries enormous risks. Intelligence sharing between NATO allies has provided unprecedented surveillance capabilities, but also created dependencies that can become vulnerabilities during escalation. Systems designed for cooperative monitoring can become targets when cooperation transforms into confrontation. The integration necessary for alliance effectiveness creates interdependencies that complicate crisis termination. When multiple nations' forces operate under unified command structures, individual countries lose some control over escalation dynamics. Putin's ultimatum forces a fundamental question about the nature of international order in the 21st century. Can the institutional framework established after World War II accommodate the ambitions of rising powers and the insecurities of declining ones, or must that framework be fundamentally restructured to prevent recurring crises? The answer to that question will determine whether current tensions represent a manageable crisis within existing institutions or the beginning of a new era characterized by direct great power competition without effective institutional constraints. Historical precedent suggests that when ultimatums are issued between nuclear powers, the window for peaceful resolution narrows rapidly. The logic of military planning begins to override diplomatic calculation as operational timelines compress decision-making processes. The challenge for all parties is maintaining enough strategic ambiguity to preserve flexibility while providing enough clarity to prevent dangerous misunderstanding. Point. That balance has become increasingly difficult to maintain as stakes rise and trust erodes. Tonight, leaders in Washington, Moscow, and Brussels face decisions that will determine whether this crisis escalates toward direct confrontation or can be managed within existing diplomatic frameworks. The margin for error has narrowed to the point where miscalculation could have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate participants. Putin's ultimatum wasn't just a message to NATO, it was a declaration that the rules governing great power relations since the end of the Cold War no longer apply. How NATO responds will determine whether new rules emerge through negotiation or through the much more dangerous process of military confrontation. The ice beneath the international system has grown dangerously thin. Whether it holds or breaks will depend on decisions made in the next hours and days by leaders who understand that they are operating at the edge of historical precedent. We are witnessing not just military buildup, but the breakdown of diplomatic language itself. Putin's ultimatum was a signal. NATO's response was confirmation. Point. The frantic reassessment now occurring within the Pentagon reveals just how fragile the foundations of international stability have become. History is turning, and the direction it takes will be determined by whether wisdom or miscalculation guides the next moves in this most dangerous game.